Welcome to the Hyphen, Indian American Dialogues. I'm your host, Sital Kalantry. Today we'll talk about immigration trends of Indians in America, from unauthorized immigration to legal immigration, as well as the reverse brain drain. Joining me today is someone who spent his career studying immigration, Professor Devesh Kapur. He is the Starr Foundation Professor of South Asian Studies and the Director of the Asia Programs at Johns Hopkins University. His body of work includes the award-winning book Diaspora, Democracy and Development, which earned a Distinguished Book Award from the International Studies Association. Defying Odds, in that book, he examined the remarkable rise of Dalit entrepreneurs in India. His most recent book is called A Sixth of Humanity with Arvind Subramaniam. Today, we're going to talk about a groundbreaking report that he co-authored about the trends of unauthorized immigration from India. The report documents that there may be anywhere from 700,000 to 220,000 undocumented immigrants from India living in the United States as of 2020. Asylum applications had also shot up from 1,000 in 2020 to 43,000 in 2023. Today, Professor Kapur will speak to us about these immigration trends of Indians in the United States. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Kapur.
Thank you, for having me.
So, as you noted in your book, The Other 1%, the Indian American community has long been associated with skilled immigration, high levels of job success, as well as a very high median income. But you recently released a report co-authored with Abby Budiman where you noted that there was an increase in undocumented immigration to the U.S. Can you tell me what inspired you to research that?
Well, in general, as you know, I've been working on Indian immigration to the U.S. for close to two decades. So the fact that there was this phenomenon of unauthorized migrants from India, I'd been following it for a while, but because of sort of other work I was doing, I did not have the time to write it up. It so happens I got an invitation to contribute to an annual volume that comes out edited by Dr. Hirudya Rajan, the India Migration report. And every year it has a theme. The 2024 one was on Indians in Canada. This year the theme was Indians in the United States. And he requested me to contribute. And I thought about it, and then I thought, okay, this might be a good way to think about and look more carefully at this issue of unauthorized migration. So that contribution, in a sense, became a focal point. Once you have a deadline, as you know, you're forced to rise to the occasion and sort of write it up.
So, before we get into the details, I'd love for you to give a high-level overview of the findings, because many people don't even realize that there has been, at some point, an increase in undocumented immigration from India.
Yeah, so I think before that, Sital, I think let's distinguish, let's be clear about what unauthorized means. So,
Yeah, that's a great.
often we think of unauthorized as really illegally entering the US. So the classic thing is, from the southern border of the US, people illegally trying to come into the US. That's the sort of classic image we have. Uh, but a second important source is people who enter the US legally, but their visa expires
Right.
and they continue to stay in the US. and therefore their status changes from legal to unauthorized.
Right.
So there are two sources. Now there are really uh, there are no precise ways of measuring it, you know, because obviously the census doesn't ask your visa status. The American community survey, which is the source of most of our data on immigrants, uh, because it has a question on place of birth, so the person was an immigrant. Uh, so that also does not ask this question, and the ACS comes out. It's done by the U.S. Census Bureau. So the way we get these numbers is they it's really what is called a residual estimate. One looks at the total number of immigrants from a country, the number who are citizens, the number who are permanent residents, the number who have temporary status, students, H-1B visa, L-1 visa, and so on. And then you add it all up, and the gap between that and the total number of migrants, that becomes the residual. So as you can see, because there are so many different types of temporary status, all of that, it's not a it's going to be uh, you know somewhat imprecise, because you're measuring it indirectly, not directly. So one of the things we show in this report is that estimates of the India's unauthorized population in Indian unauthorized Indian immigrants in the US varies quite widely between the official estimates uh, from the government and by very well respected sort of other sources like Pew. These estimates were roughly in parallel from 2000 to about 2017-18, and since then have diverged widely, and we're not quite sure why.
Yeah, that was my question as well.
Uh,
Is
and so,
the variations?
so that was one. The second was the very large increase in asylum seekers from 2020 to 2023, which increased almost, you know, uh, more than 10 times, almost an order of magnitude. And this, as you know, that after COVID, when President Biden was elected, he opened up the southern border, and there was a surge of migrants, not only from India, but from other parts of the world. Uh, and that is how we see this big increase that happens in 2022, 2023, and basically really comes to a stop as the elections approach. President Biden becomes tougher as he realizes that the political costs and the backlash against this is rising. And of course, when President Trump is elected, it 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 sort of becomes much more constricted. So we don't have the most recent numbers, but I'm sure there's going to be a sharp fall sort of after that.
So your data covered the period mostly up to 2024, and we can assume that, as with all undocumented immigration across the border, has decreased due to the enforcement measures, the other rhetoric that we hear from our administration. But when that period did occur, what is the variations of the estimate? What's sort of the highest to the lowest estimates of people? And now, just to be clear, um, I guess what I'm thinking about is sort of people who are making this tough journey across the sea, and then throughout the Latin America to come across the border, not necessarily the sort of visa overstays.
So, you had asked for what surprised. One of the surprises was that, especially 2023, the sharp increase in entry from the northern border from
Mm.
Canada. So, until then, 95% was always from the south. But that year, about 35 to 40% was from the north. Now, you don't have to make that tough thing, which is to go to Latin America and then, essentially trek your way through Central America, Mexico to arrive at the Mexican border. Because Canada, one of the routes was Canada has a lot of, basically substandard fly by night sort of diploma mills which give student visas.
Mm.
You come as a student, and then you don't really enroll, and instead you migrate down south. So it's a much more quote unquote comfortable journey relative to coming from the southern
Right.
border.
So, about what percentage was north? What percentage was south? Do you recall?
So roughly it was about 60-40 in that year. But Canada, everyone has begun to tighten up because much of this of seeking asylum, as we show in the paper also, that it's really, frankly, a significant part of it. At least I'm only talking about India is organized. I mean, it's not really about the usual way we think about asylum as people who are persecuted and face genuine fear, and that's the reason. Because what we show is that they're basically largely by far from Punjab and then from Gujarat. These are India's richest states. It costs about $50,000 plus to get all the illegal papers, to pay the smuggling networks, all of that. Which is about 20 times India's per capita income. And if it was a genuine asylum seekers, there would be much more from, say, India's more marginalized social groups, whether SC, STs, or Muslims, or from places where there is considerable civil conflict, whether India's Maoist belt or the Northeast or Kashmir, and we see no evidence of that.
Yeah, and I thought that was a very interesting finding that the people who are migrating, right, are not the poorest of the poor who are coming to say, which is different from maybe the people who come from the southern border from Central America, which, in my experience, I've represented many of those people in their asylum proceedings. But it's well off, relatively middle class people who've sold their houses, their belongings
Right.
to even make a
The
better
land.
life, right? And so that was a really interesting finding.
Yeah, so they're basically economic migrants who are not poor because you have to be rich enough to afford that journey. I mean, $50,000 is a serious amount of money for an average Indian.
Right.
So, and that is usually done because the prices of land, and these are largely rural, they are not uneducated, but they are weakly educated in the sense they have degrees but not skills. And it's not about deprivation, but relative to deprivation, in the sense they don't see great economic opportunities given their skills, and therefore the relatives or parents sell a part of the land, some part of the household assets in order to finance this
And so
journey.
the people coming from Gujarat were largely Hindus, or were there Muslims as well?
No, so Sital, the official data from the US, it doesn't give us religion.
Okay.
We know the language they speak. Uh, when we look at stories of those who are apprehended, so that is, of course, not a representative sample. they seem to be much more Hindus.
So, I mean, as you know, right, there's like five grounds for asylum, right? There's race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, and political opinion. And as you rightly noted, I have done one case of caste violence, right? A woman and a man married across caste and were facing persecution from their own family. And
Right.
so had fled here, and we were able to get them asylum, get them out of detention. But I mean, I'm speculating because I haven't reviewed what the claims for asylum were, but I'm wondering if it, what the argument, at least from Punjab, could be sort of we have a difference in opinion and our political opinions are being repressed.
Frankly, Sital, it's hard to say that their political opinions are being
Right.
repressed.
Well,
Uh,
if they want, if I mean separatism, I mean that's
yeah, yeah.
certainly
So, yeah,
many of the refugees that came here early in Seattle, right, are came in the '80s as asylum seekers and that were received asylum post, in the Irani's assassination.
yeah. So that was very much valid in the 80s and early 90s. There was a lot of violence in Punjab. There were severe violations of civil rights and civil liberties. And but really, from the 2000s onwards, I mean, remember India had a Sikh prime minister. The head of Indian army was a Sikh. uh, it's 2% of the population, but they occupied the highest levels of government. I was an advisor to the government of Punjab, led by a Sikh, and they were quite unhappy with the actions of the diaspora in Canada and the US, because it just made their lives much more problematic.
So, what do you feel is the future of immigration trends to the US? We have over 5 million people here, largely in these two large waves, post 1965 generation and then the H-1B in the last several decades. But do you see a potential reverse in this?
So, see, the almost uh, between three-fifths to two-thirds of all Indians in the immigrants in the US have come after 2000. So the majority is really very, very recent. Uh, there is no doubt that there is a massive backlash against immigration in the US broadly, especially under this government. While our discussion has been on unauthorized migrants, and you hear about these deportation flights, etc. The There is more visibility, but the actual numbers, the most recent data, the average in sort of 2000 to 2022, or yeah, was about not 2000 to 2009. That's when I have the numbers. So for about 14, 15 years, it was about 1,000 a year, uh, Indians being deported back to India from the US. Last year, it climbed to 3,000. Now, that's barely 1% of the estimated unauthorized. At that rate, it would take 100 years to deport,
Right,
all the Indians. And that's, of course, not going to happen.
right,
I think the bigger thing is that behind all the uproar on the illegal, unauthorized migrants, there's a quiet thing to really squeeze legal immigration,
right,
and that is happening. It's death with 1,000 cuts. It's everything from student visas to H-1B visas to making it harder to get to transition from an H1 to a green card, making it harder to transition from a green card to citizenship until your time runs out. So just making it harder so you get more frustrated and leave, or you get more frustrated and don't apply.
right. I think those are exactly the right four factors that you listed. And that's sort of the thought is not just that they're deporting people, but for all the reasons you said, they're making it hard for people to come in by
Right.
restricting H-1Bs through the fees, making it harder for those who are here to transition into legal residency, then to citizenship, and then finally just making it so frustrating generally. And it's appealing. India is much different than it was 25 years ago, so there are opportunities there. So there'll be a voluntary reverse brain drain is a real possibility, I think, in the next 3 more years, or 2 or 3 more years of this administration, assuming, yeah, and possibly longer.
Yeah. I mean, uh, I've been doing surveys with colleagues, Milan Vaishnav at the Carnegie Endowment and Sumitra Badrinathan at American University. The one we did in late 2024, I mean, late 2025. So we do see greater apprehensions among Indian Americans. But right now, we don't see strong evidence, or at least in their opinions, it's only been 1 year in that sense when we did the survey, of a strong desire to go back, because many of them have economic jobs here, and so right now we see a modest uptick in return, but not a big uptick yet. That, as you rightly said, that could change. It depends how much more this intensifies, etc., etc. Uh, and some might have to, because if you don't get an H-1B, if you can't go from an F-1 visa to an OPT to a H-1B, or you can't go from an H-1B to a green card, you will have no option but to leave.
And one of the things that just was in the news yesterday, and if you're able to talk about it, right, is this reposting of a social media podcaster that President Trump did, right, who was railing against the Silicon Valley, the Indians that are in the tech space, saying it really leaves no room for American workers, and you know all these epithets to basically calling India, a shithole. And I think this comes right in a larger context of backlash. This isn't just one moment. What this made international news, and to the extent that Ranveer Jaiswalji has responded in his post. But this comes in the context of multiple of these incidents. But what elevated it was the reposting by President Trump.
Absolutely. I mean, we do see in our survey, when we ask Indians, a sharp increase in hate speech, especially in social media, all of that. And that is definitely creating greater anxieties and anger in the community. And when the president of the country, becomes a loudspeaker, like for these views, that can only make it worse.
Your survey that you talked about, the Carnegie Endowment for Peace, I thought it was a fascinating survey. Apropos to what we're talking about, what concerned me was that your findings was something like 31% of Indians who were surveyed in this like very methodologically solid Gallup poll like survey said that they are afraid to express their political views on social media. Another 19% said they don't feel comfortable dressing in their traditional attire publicly. Several were fearful of leaving for not being able to come back to the US. So in a way, I understand how people feel this way, particularly those who are not citizens are more vulnerable. Even those who are citizens may be vulnerable, depending on what the Supreme Court says in this birthright citizenship case. But leaving that aside for a moment, I almost feel that it is the opposite approach, right, that we should be having. We ought to be more doubling down on our social and political work in the country than in a way to address these issues.
So, there is a line of thinking that when for individuals, if their identities are under attack, uh, and this could be place of birth or skin color or religion or etc., etc., you often see two opposite reactions. One is to try and suppress that identity to the extent possible. So, for instance, I will not wear ethnic clothes, right? Because it identifies me much more clearly. The second is the opposite, which is defiance. So it reinforces your identity, it hardens it rather than the other way around, right? Uh, and so you get like almost a split going more to the extremes as a result of this. Uh, and I suspect that you're going to see that if you ask the question of Indian Americans, do you see yourself more Indian than American, or more American than Indian, or just Indian, or just American? I suspect that there will be more who might just move to say, no, no, I'm not Indian American, I'm an American. And some who might move to say, no, no, I'm more Indian than American as a reaction to this pressure.
Yeah, there's a lot to be thought about and talked about. One thing I also want to talk about, sort of the consequence of this moment of decreased immigration and increased deportation, and increase in feelings of uh, alienation. How, how do you see, your, maybe the other 1% book you wrote, what would be the prologue, what would be the epilogue, and how do you think this would maybe affect the tech industry and America's progress in that?
So when we wrote the book, when the first edition came out, Trump had not been elected. The second edition, we did write a prologue where we did say that the age of immigration to the U.S. might be coming to an end. By the golden age, meaning, there was one from the 1880s to World War One. Then we know it for half a century it dropped sharply till 1965, and then for another half century it grew massively, and now, with that retrenchment. Now, how it might affect America's tech sector, I think one should be careful about making uh, facile judgments, because say in the past you needed people who could do coding, the classic computer engineer. With AI you may need far fewer,
Right.
right? So this change in American politics and attitudes and policies towards immigration is occurring concurrently with massive technological changes. Now, those massive technological changes may require more of extremely good talent, the top 1%, but may not require the top 10%. We know that it is getting harder even for Native Americans who've gone to college to get jobs, because job market, as a result of multiple factors, not just technological change, but nonetheless. So it is possible that economic shifts in the US may change the demand side in labor markets, which may, in any case, make it harder for anyone to get a job, let alone immigrants,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
And of course, immigrants then will be affected even more. And if in particular it's harder to come to a US university and harder to stay on after you graduate from a US university, we will see a shift of students, and we already see more Indian students going to Europe, etc., because their parents
Australia,
are
Singapore,
applicants.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that I think is, I mean, we see that a lot already happening with Chinese, students, even more than Indians, but it is and will happen also with Indian students.
Um, this has been really informative and fascinating. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Hyphen Indian American Dialogues. If you enjoyed this episode of the Hyphen, please comment and share this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel and leave a comment. Thank you to our producers, Ashini, Jagtiani, Shannon Young, and Social Sherpa. I also wanted to give a big thanks to our media partner, India Abroad.